the final percent. The final percent.
All right, so welcome to another episode of the Final Percent podcast. And today you have guest Eileen Gallagher, guest hosting instead of Greg Kimball. And we have Vicki Hunter with us today. So she and I met probably 6 or 8 weeks ago, maybe even a little bit longer, sometime this summer at an OsteoStrong event where I was actually speaking kind of about health and vitality. And she has her own experience of health and vitality in her life. She's a distance runner, has been for a long time. She was a political science professor at CU for 23 years and is retired from that and is doing some foundations coaching, which we can talk a little bit about that as well. But just a general super cool human. And we talk a lot about doing cool things with cool people. And so wanted to be able to share some of her life experience and things that she's done. She grew up on the East Coast and moved out to Colorado. So why don't you tell us maybe a little bit about what brought you out to Colorado initially?
Okay, thank you, Eileen. It's so great to be here with you. And when I met Eileen and heard her speak, I knew I needed to know you better because I just felt such a deep connection right away. Meeting a strong, powerful woman who's doing amazing things, for me, is always exciting. So I love that we kind of formed that connection right away. And it was so easy. I mean, when we went for coffee that one time, I was like, oh my God, I feel like we're sisters. Yeah, fast.
Exactly.
So I grew up on the East Coast. As you said, I went to Mount Holyoke College. I was very academically driven in college, and also athletically driven. So I played competitive lacrosse in high school and college. I did tons of other sports, always very active from the time I can remember. I mean, from the time I could basically run around the backyard. I was just very competitive.
From the time you started walking.
Basically. And so sports were always super important to me. And then my dad was a teacher, and I think his push for education, and in his family, that was a super important thing. So I was also pretty driven on that side of things. So I went to Mount Holyoke and knew I wanted to go on in academia after several kind of different life choices brought me to that conclusion. And after graduation, I moved to Hawaii because I needed a break from school. And I basically played on the beach and waitressed for a couple years. And
I don't know if I heard that
and
before.
It was super fun. But it just fed my athletic drive because at the time triathlon was becoming kind of a bigger thing. This was the early 80s, and the Ironman was fairly new there, and I kind of dabbled in triathlon. But running and being competitive were just kind of side things for me. I mean, it was very soul soothing to be an athlete, but it definitely wasn't a career choice. I knew in my family that was just not something women did. Like, I had to do something more sustainable and more substantial. So getting my PhD was kind of next on the list. So I applied to several graduate schools. I got into CU Boulder, and I thought, all right, I'll move to Boulder. My sister lived in Colorado, and I thought, this sounds like a great place to go. Well, little did I know that Boulder was kind of the epicenter of running. I mean, I really didn't know that. Maybe I had heard it, but it just was not the reason I moved here. But once I was here, running was just like thrown in my face, and what a beautiful place, right? So I started running more, and I ran on the trails, and I met a ton of elite runners in town. And again, I was fledgling in my running career. I run one marathon. I finished barely.
That's more than most people can say.
But I did finish, and it was a great experience, and I loved to run. So I thought, well, I want to do more of this. But I really didn't know what I was doing. Lo and behold, I meet all these elite athletes, and they kind of take me under their wing. I mean, I don't even know why. But I met a bunch of them. I met also a gentleman who actually I ended up having a relationship with. He was a rolfer, and he basically decided that I was going to be a marathon runner. And
well, they saw potential in you that sometimes probably you didn't even see in yourself.
I think so. And I still appreciate that to this day because those people who believed in me helped me to believe in myself. And so I started training, and I was a over 4-hour marathoner. But this gentleman said to me, well, I think you can qualify for the Olympic trials. I'm like, what are the Olympic trials, and what does that mean? And so at this point, this is 1986, and there had only been one year of the Olympics where women were running the marathon. So in 1984 was the first year the women were able to run the marathon. And so 1988 was coming up, and it was going to be the second time. The U.S. picks their marathon runners through
About a
the
year
Olympic
ahead.
trial. Yeah, about a year ahead through a process called the Olympic trials, where the top 3 go to the Olympics. You have to run a qualifying time to get into the trials. So he tells me that the qualifying time is 2:50. I'm like, 2:50?
That's like more than an hour.
I've run 4:10, like 4:09. What, are you crazy? But he said, you can do it. And I thought, all right, I'll start training. So I did, and with his help and several of the elite runners in town, a year and a half later, I ran 2:49 at the Twin Cities Marathon.
I'm just trying to cut like 5 minutes off my Boulder time, not an hour off my
I
marathon.
will tell you, it was something kind of astounding to me and also empowering. And it did change my life, because all of a sudden I'm running times that are putting me kind of in the national class of women distance runners.
Well, and that belief in yourself by other people, or belief from
Yes.
other people that's borrowed. And we talk about that a lot in coaching, is sometimes you have to have other people that believe in you
Yes.
before you believe in yourself. And then it builds the confidence in you to actually get to the next level.
100%. But at the same time, I'm still in my doctoral program. I'm still trying to finish my PhD.
Right.
And fortunately, I had a professor, a mentor, who was very supportive. He was big into sports, and he gave me a lot of support. I was his research assistant, and he gave me the room to explore this running side of myself. At the same time, I became a running coach under the tutelage of a coach in town, Rick Rojas, who coached kids, and he won the very first Boulder. And so I became a coach underneath him, coaching kids, and that was kind of where my running coaching started.
Okay.
I had coached lacrosse earlier in my life, but this was new.
Right.
Well, this was a whole learning process, right? I mean, I really didn't know much about running when I started this process, but over the last 37 years, I've educated myself.
Well, it's become part of who you are.
It totally has become part of who I am. So the problem was for me, I started having the success in running. And when I first started running, I'm going to take a step back, it was really to soothe myself. I grew up in a household where I had a very depressed mother. And I swore to myself when I was younger that I was not going to be like that. So movement was my medicine.
Or your way out of
That
prevention.
depression, yes. So for me, it was always just about making myself feel better. It never was about running fast times or
Getting to the Olympics.
yeah, no, that had nothing to do with it. But once I started running faster times, that's a very seductive thing. And so then
What's crossing some of those accomplishments and then being more motivated to do more and to achieve more and succeed more.
yeah. And I'm already that kind of person who likes to
driven.
achieve things. And one of the confounding things for me when I was growing up is that part of my achievement-oriented drive was thinking that it would make my mother happy. The more I achieved, I thought, well, this is going to make her happy. It never did. I mean, it was very fleeting.
Well, and so much of happiness is an inside job, so things you're doing aren't going to necessarily make her happy.
But as a kid, I thought, well, if I just get that next A.
Right.
Oh, if I'm like the star on the team.
Right.
If I run a fast race, maybe that will give her joy. And it would for about 2 seconds. And then she would go right back to her depression and her kind of not feeling good about herself. So in some ways, it was just a double-edged sword, because everything I did that was achievement-oriented, I was her kid, so she was happy for me, but at the same time, I think it made her feel somewhat bad about herself.
Like less than or inadequate or
Yeah,
something?
because she never got to explore her athletic side.
Well, and some of that was generational. Their generation, women didn't have those same opportunities.
100%. And I knew that to a certain degree, or I figured out, but she, I think,
She just felt the limitations, maybe.
yes, and she never really got to explore. She had so much talent on so many levels, and she never really got to fully explore those sides of herself, her athletic side. She was an amazing businesswoman, but at the same time, she was never encouraged to do that. So there were things that she never got to, I think, fully develop.
Or explore.
That I did.
Right.
So anyway, she and I battled throughout our lives, to be honest, because there was this push-pull. I was trying to achieve. She would kind of be happy for me, but at the same time, she would push back against me, and that kind of went on for much of my adult life. And trying to kind of parse that out was part of my journey. It's still part of my journey, even though she's gone now.
Well, finding forgiveness and
yeah.
how do you move on and how do you then empower your children, which we'll talk about a little bit later
Exactly.
too.
So anyway, going back to kind of the progression of my life, I continued to be fairly successful at running, even while I got my PhD, and then I got a teaching position at CU, and was able to kind of join both of those things. And that one of the reasons I stayed in Boulder was because I could do both. I could teach, I could be an athlete, I could be a coach, and all of those things kind of came together. And I was going for all of it. I was running ultra distance races. I was running with my friends in the mountains all day. I was teaching classes. At the same time, I was approaching 30, and I wanted a baby. Like, I really wanted to have a family.
You were ready.
I was ready.
You felt your clock ticking.
I did, and it was, like a time bomb going off my body. Because before that, in my mid-20s,
you were focused on other things.
and I didn't think I wanted kids.
Yeah.
But then when it hit hard.
Yeah.
So then, of course, because I'm so driven and focused, I thought, okay, now it's time to find
your partner.
Yeah. And so I took that on as my next mission and went through several relationships, some that weren't so great.
Yeah.
But then met my husband-to-be when he was still married. We met when I was about 34. We became friends, but he was just as much of an athlete as me, which was very appealing to me. He was also super fun. But when I found out he was married, I'm like, nope, that's not for me.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go down that road. But his first marriage didn't work out. So he actually called me out of the blue one day. I'd just gotten out of a really bad relationship. And he told me what was happening. And I just said, well, you need to come out with me and my friends. We're just going to go out and have fun.
See what happens.
Yeah. But I wasn't even thinking about him being in a relationship with him because I thought he's
still dealing with his old, his divorce and
but
transition.
then I opened the door when he came to pick me up, and I took one look at him, and I said,
I'm in trouble.
I knew I was in trouble. And it was pretty much, for me, love at first sight. I mean,
interesting.
And within 3 months.
Because there was the possibility, whereas before there wasn't the possibility.
Yes, I suppose. And he just had this magnetism about him. And we were both we had the same interests. We both loved to be out running all day, biking.
Or outside, doing activities, engaging in life.
So that connection and the fact that he was so fun just kind of pulled us together. Well, within 3 months, we were basically engaged. I'd say within 3 weeks, we were practically living together.
Inseparable.
Yeah, so it just happened very quickly. Just like everything else in my life at that time, I feel like everything was just in this fast pace. And that's just kind of part of who I am, I suppose. I think growing up on the East Coast, things tend to be pretty fast-paced, and my family was certainly like that. Very impatient. You want everything yesterday. Like, it's not enough to have it today. You want it yesterday, and then you want to just go into the future.
Right.
So I kind of continued on that path, and my husband was kind of on a similar path. He's manic in so many ways. So we kind of fit, but I really didn't know what I was getting into when I married him. It was kind of like marrying a tornado. And we got engaged, we got married. I was pregnant within 2 months. And I continued down this path of just going for it. I was working full time.
Right.
I'm still trying to do all my athletic stuff. And he and I were just kind of going full bore. And then
something happened that then inspired you to write your book.
Yes, something pretty horrific.
Yeah.
So I was 14 weeks pregnant. We were living we both had wanted to live in the mountains, so we bought a house up on Magnolia Road, which for anyone who doesn't live in Boulder, to get to Magnolia Road, you go up Boulder Canyon, and it's kind of a pretty isolated area. It's a few thousand feet above Boulder, and it was magical. We had 30 acres. It was pretty much heaven on earth, but the drive was not heaven on earth for me.
Especially in the winter.
Yeah, and so to be honest, this day, it was September 11th, 1997, of all days, right? So 9/11.
Except for that was many years before 9/11.
It was 4 years before, but it's just, to me, it's such an interesting idea that it happened on this day. And I had gone to work, my husband had gone to work, we drove separately. We went to a function at Boulder Theater that evening. Again, I'm 14 weeks pregnant. I was having really bad morning sickness, so nothing was appealing to me eating-wise. So once again, my blood sugar was probably low, and there was no food to be spoken of at this event. So I turned to my husband around 9 o'clock and I said, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm gonna go home. He walks me to my car. It's the last thing I remember. I drove up the mountain, the top of the mountain. I lost control of the car. I spun into a tree. The entire right side of the car was smashed in on my body. And I don't remember any of this because I have amnesia around the accident. Someone found me shortly after this happened. I was off the road in a field, and they called 911. A helicopter landed in the field. Meanwhile, my husband doesn't know what happened.
He's still at the event.
He left about a half hour, 45 minutes after me, comes up the road, sees this line of cars, flashing
Helicopter.
lights. He didn't see the helicopter yet because he wasn't there.
Close enough.
But he sees these cars and he starts running down the road. A cop tells him that someone was in an accident. He said, "What's the car?" The cop says a white Subaru. He literally panics, runs towards me. Again, now the helicopter is there. He tells them I'm pregnant. They didn't know that I was pregnant. So I get flown to a trauma hospital, St. Anthony's in Denver. The next morning, I was actually talking apparently, but when I wake up or come to consciousness in the hospital room, I can't talk because I have a tube down my throat. And I had so many injuries, but having a like a tube down my throat and then a tube in my side.
Did you have a pneumothorax or something?
Yes, and then I had broken 10 ribs. I had a collapsed lung. I had a punctured liver. I had 3 skull fractures resulting in brain injury. I broke my sacrum. I broke my pubic symphysis.
For an athlete, that all sounds really bad.
It was really bad. But the brain injury was so interesting because I knew what happened, but I didn't know what happened. So I couldn't talk, but I wrote him a note. I said, how did I get into a bike accident? I actually thought I had been in a bike accident.
Interesting.
And he said that didn't happen. Like, I didn't ask that first day, although that's my memory. He says, and that wasn't for a couple days where I asked that. But regardless, I didn't know what had happened.
Why am I here? What happened?
Yes. Now, I did know I was pregnant at some level. I knew I was pregnant. But I was in that intensive care unit for over 2.5 weeks. And they monitored everything. But they couldn't do anything besides give me some pain medication. So I was on morphine, which was horrifying to me because I knew the baby was inside me. I did not want to be on pain medication. So as soon as I could, I weaned myself off of that. After 2.5 weeks, they decided I was ready to go to a therapy hospital, which I went to
Like a rehabilitation center?
Yeah, so I went to the Mapleton Rehab Center. And basically, I spent the next 6 months getting ready to have that baby. And I took it on like I was training for my next marathon. I just set a schedule in my mind that I was going to train.
To be a mom and be ready to have the baby.
And, you know, of course it was scary because we didn't know if she was okay. I mean, we kind of knew because they were monitoring her.
Well, she's pretty protected at 14 weeks.
Yes, and that's what the doctor said. So she was definitely, the amniotic fluid is an amazing thing. So she was pretty protected, and lo and behold, she was born on her due date, which I still find a total miracle.
Yeah.
I did need a C-section, but I went into labor.
You're a pretty tiny lady too. So.
Well, right. So who knows if I would have been able to have her.
You might have had a
naturally.
C-section anyway.
Yeah. But what happened was I was recovered enough. By the time I was 7 months pregnant, I was out snowshoeing in the mountains outside our house with poles, and you know, she's like this out in front of me, this big. I was huge. I looked like a stick figure with a basketball.
Well, being as trim as you are, there's not a lot of space in your body for it to go, so it all had to come out.
That's true. That's what I looked like. I mean, I look at pictures of myself, I'm like, wow.
I have a watermelon in front of me.
Yes. So I definitely recovered, but I will never forget the feeling I had when I was in labor. All of the pain memories of being back in the intensive care unit just came flooding back into my body.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of was reliving the trauma.
A little PTSD from the accident when you were in the hospital.
Yeah. But then she was born, and she was healthy, and it was amazing. The next 6 weeks were euphoric for both of us. And there were some complications, but they weren't connected to the accident. She was born with a club foot, which we dealt with in many ways, but she otherwise was completely healthy. And to this day, she's an amazing athlete and an amazing human. But she's had struggles that I think, many kids go through. I think because she had that trauma while she was in the womb, I think she had an added challenge as she was growing up. But meanwhile,
So there was some maybe physical memory for her, even though she wasn't on the outside when it happened.
I think that's probably accurate.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of traumas that we don't necessarily learn to process or know how to process.
Yeah.
That there's residual effects of later in life.
I agree. And so what happened was when she was a baby, I'm thinking, wow, this is a miracle. I recovered from this accident. She was
It's doing
born.
great.
And I thought, I have to write a book about this. So early on, I decided I was going to write a book. But it was going to be this kind of, I don't know, just a tell-all of how I did it, how I recovered from this horrible accident. But meanwhile, I had another child a couple years later. And
you were busy parenting and
I'm parenting,
PhDing and running.
Yeah, and I'm teaching full-time at the or three-quarter time at the university.
Yeah.
Trying to continue the running.
Yeah.
And at a pretty.
And you were able to re-engage in the running with your recovery pretty well.
I was, which was also
a miracle.
A miracle, especially in the hospital when I couldn't walk. I was in a wheelchair. I had said to myself, I said it inside and I said it actually to my husband. I said, it's okay, if I never run again, it'll be fine as long as this
She's
baby
okay.
is born healthy. Well, that went out the window pretty much as soon as I
She was born,
realized
or?
I could run. Once I could run, I thought, well, how fast can I run? Because that's where my brain
Well, because you're
would
so
go.
driven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pretty soon I'm back running races. My husband and I are going to 50-mile races. We're doing, back on that treadmill of achieving,
Yep.
but also bringing our kids with us whenever we can to whatever race we signed up for. It became a family affair. Tried to include them in everything we did. And that next period of life was very intense. I mean, I think back and I think how much we tried to cram in, not just into our lives in general, but into a day. I mean, we never had a day that was still. We were
On the go.
on the go all the time. And the kids learned that kind of way of being. And I think in some ways they decided that wasn't working for them. I remember when they were about, both kids, one was maybe 9 and the other was 12, and Brian and I would wake up and we'd say, okay, we're going to Eldora, we're going to ski. And they're like, no, we're not. We don't want to go. And Brian and I would look at each other, well, what do you mean you don't want to go? Of course we're going. And there was a point where we had to say, okay, you don't want to go? We can leave you home.
Kids start to have a voice of their own at some
Exactly.
point.
And I appreciate that they kind of stuck up for
Well,
themselves.
and good that you gave them the space to have a voice of their own.
Yeah, so they did, but we always insisted that they be athletic in some way because that's what saved us. And we thought, we wanted them to have that as a resource.
One as an outlet for managing stress. And
Yes. But they did rebel against it as teenagers, and we went through a lot of strife when both girls were teenagers. There were many things that we had to balance. Brian and I had some marital issues based around financial stuff, and then we found out Jade had a drug problem when she was in high school. And Brian was a recovering alcoholic. So there were many pieces coming into this.
Most people's lives are very layered.
Very layered. But I think what I didn't realize at the time was how much I was using my exercise and running in particular to run away from anything that was hard. Like for running for me was always a safe place. That's where I felt good. It's where I felt good about myself. It was achievement oriented. So it gave
And you had control over all of it.
control, huge, right? So I continued to rely on that. Well, the year that changed everything, I'm kind of jumping ahead
Sure,
a little
yeah.
bit, but it takes
But I
us.
mean, it's kind of the thoughts of the book way back.
Yes.
And then moving along through the next parts of your life.
Right.
To then how the book evolved to
Right.
being different than here's what happened, but here's what it taught
Right.
me.
And exactly. And I am a planner. So I had it all planned out. I planned out I was going to get my PhD. I was going to get married and have a baby. At least one, and I did have 2. I was going to keep teaching. I was going to keep running. And just, it was based on all these milestones that I saw myself achieving. Well, of course, life just doesn't go that smoothly.
Especially with parenting.
Especially with parenting. And, that's the thing that no one tells you when you decide to become a parent. So in 2016, I was getting ready to retire from CU because I had been on a journey of kind of improving my own body, I still had some residual effects from the accident. And so I would go to bed every night in some sort of pain. My back was still very compromised. But in 2014, I found something called foundation training that gave me relief. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I want to learn this. I want to teach this. So when I decided to retire from CU, I wanted to take my next chapter into helping people find relief from pain.
Well, we kind of talked a little bit about the coaching pieces, like with your running coaching,
Yes.
being coached,
Yes.
and then helping with coaching probably was a really great segue for you to move into coaching with foundations because you understand the way people operate, and then being someone who'd been an elite athlete that had a lot of injuries and other things, and then transitioned into this place of the accident, and then into your own recovery process, but then found something that could actually really truly help you heal besides just barreling through things.
Right.
If this can make me feel better, how can I share something that can make other people feel better?
And that is what happened. I can't say that I had that. I never knew when I embarked on the journey of getting certified in foundation training where it was going to take me.
We don't always have the epiphany beforehand.
We don't. But what did happen is in 2016, which was the year I retired from CU, it was the year my mother passed away, and it was the year we found out Jade had this drug problem.
That's a big year.
It was huge. And
Kind of pulls the rug out from under you a little bit.
it totally pulled the rug out. And I have a quote in the book by Zora Neale Thurston saying, there are years that ask questions and there are years that answer. And for me, 2016 was definitely the year that asked
A
the
lot of
questions.
questions.
And it took me the next, well, I'm still unraveling the answers. But I still was determined to write the book about my recovery because I felt like at that point, I just wanted to tell people, well, this is how you do it. And I have the answers. Well, towards the end of that year, here I am thinking I have the answers.
A little humbling experience.
I'm running on the trails with my niece up in Aspen. Again, I had been pushing the envelope of activity. I trip on a pebble that was probably this big, but I land on a boulder that is huge. And I break my arm in half. And it was like the world saying, Vicki,
Slow
you
down.
might think you have things under control, but you do not.
Right.
And it started me on this journey of really having to look deeper. Like, what is going on here? How come you keep having these accidents that are not accidents? Like in my mind, yes, they're unfortunate things that happen to me, but there's a pattern here, and I needed to get to the bottom of it.
Well, the other thing we say, things don't happen to you, things happen for you.
Yes. And I look back now on the car accident, on breaking the arm, and as much as it sounds crazy and as painful as those experiences were, they definitely brought me to this chapter in my life, which now being over 60 and being on this path of exploration of not just physical health, which I do think I'm in a pretty good place, but
You're
also
exceptional, especially for most people in your age group. You are a specimen of physical
thank you.
wellness in lots of ways for all the things you've been through.
But I still think I'm seeking out the balance. And it's the second half of the title of my book is Seeking Balance in
Yes,
an
we have the
Imperfect
book
World.
for you to look at. It's called Running and Returning, Seeking Balance in an Imperfect World. So talk a little bit about writing the book and then kind of what evolution you went through with writing the book.
Okay. Well, writing the book, like I said, I retired in July of 2016, and I gave myself a year. I'm going to write this book. It's going to be done in a year.
I'm going to be done.
Yeah, I found an editor, and the first editor, she worked with me, and she said, yeah, you have some work to do. But we were back and forth, and it was a really interesting process because she was mostly kind of coaching me on the organization of the book. And
Well, with a PhD in political science, you've done a lot of writing with your thesis and all that, so you have writing experience, but writing a novel or a book is very different than writing.
it was so different. I mean,
Yeah.
I started out writing as like an academic.
I'm going to do my thesis.
Yes, and this book could not be that. But it started out like that, and that was a way to get words on paper.
Right.
But I went so far with that first editor, her name was Terja, and she was great. But then we got to a point where we really weren't making more progress.
You're kind of at a standstill.
So and again, I was a little frustrated because I thought at this point, I thought I was going to have a book. So then I kept exploring, and I did sometime shortly after that, in that next year, I did a meditation retreat. And that was super helpful in getting me, it was a running and meditation retreat. So we were moving, and yes, I wasn't there yet. I wasn't that evolved. But it did help me to start putting some pieces together. And what I realized in that retreat is that this book was not just about my recovery. I had to bring in my mother's story and my daughter's story. Like, it was just not going to be enough.
Well, and sometimes it's generational things that happen that help you understand your own participation on kind of both ends.
Yeah, so that became a big theme for me, is the intergenerational trauma. I realized that my mother's depression contributed to her issues as an adult and what she used as coping mechanisms, and then that was transferred to me.
But your coping mechanisms just look different.
Yes, and
yours
then
is running
Jade
and physical activity.
picked different coping mechanisms, but we all had that underlying trauma that was passed down. And so I look at it, I don't claim to be an expert on intergenerational trauma, but I did do research while I was writing the book. And so it brought me to that next phase. And then I found another editor who really pushed me. Her name's Sarah, and she just got me to be really vulnerable and honest. And that was super hard. It was 3 years of working with her, of writing, and I'd give her the manuscript and I'd say, nah, she's gonna love this. And I would get it back with just marked up to pieces. I'd be like,
Read
"Oh."
everywhere.
Yes, everywhere.
Well,
And
you're used to being the one who's the performer, and now you're basically being told, well, you're kind of in the crawling stage.
yes, and that's how it felt. But I didn't give up, and I just kept working on
Because
it.
you're persistent. We talk about, Greg talks a lot about being a perseverance expert, and a lot of times with things in our life, you really just have to keep pushing yourself to achieve it and do more and do better and figure out kind of how to navigate the system a little bit.
And while I'm writing the book, I mean, you have to remember, in the first 3 years, we're still helping Jade navigate her recovery.
Yeah.
So she was, we were trying to help her become sober and find that path, which she did. I mean, she's doing great now.
Yeah, she's amazing.
But she had to find her own path.
Yeah.
And she had to make the choices herself. Like, as much as we wanted to model for her and do what we did, that was not going to be her.
Her choices were going to be different.
Yeah. So we had to let that happen. I had to grieve my mother in a way that I wasn't ready to do.
When she first passed.
Yes. So that also was happening. My father had passed a couple years before. I had to deal with some of those emotions as well. So there was a whole grieving process that went on while I was writing the book, and also this deeper understanding of myself and what drives me to do what I do. And I had to recognize that I've chosen running as my coping mechanism. And yes, I still love to run. It's still my go-to. It's still part of my identity. But there are times when it has not served me. And I've made bad choices. So kind of coming to those conclusions, it's still a work in progress. I'm not perfect at this. I still...
Perfect is overrated anyways.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I will say to the outward eye, I might still seem obsessed. I'm running the New York City Marathon next week. I haven't been willing to give up those goals because they still make me feel really good. But
Well, it gives you a way to push yourself with your training and to continue to achieve.
Yeah.
But you have it in a different perspective than you did many years ago.
For sure. And I have a much more balanced approach to training, to my goals. I think I'm much more realistic about what I'm trying to achieve. I decided to do a charity, like I'm devoting...
You're running for a charity.
I'm running for a charity.
Oh, fun. So doing donations.
Yes. So that also feels so much more meaningful.
Well, it's nourishing to the soul because you're giving back. You're doing something for yourself, but you're also then able to give back to people who are in need.
Yeah. So I'm just seeking out ways to make my life more balanced.
Nice.
On a daily basis. I mean, I just try to find the joy in just being on a daily basis rather than having to achieve some major thing every day.
Well, and a lot of it's working on vitality from a different perspective. So instead of the push, it's the finding the balance like you talk about.
Yes. So sharing foundation training for me, which is a postural alignment program developed by a chiropractor named Dr. Eric Goodman, who anyone can look that up online. You can Google Dr. Eric Goodman. You can find foundation training. it changed my life, I will be honest. It gave me more power over my own body. I had been dealing with injuries my whole life, and foundation training was the first thing that kind of fit my new perspective of how can I come to more balance without a lot of strife. You know, like more, it's something you can use every day. It's something that you don't need equipment. You need someone to kind of teach you initially, but then it's something that you can integrate into your life.
Well, it's all about stabilizing the core so that your whole body is overall strong, but to have that, which is probably the impetus behind the name, but to have that strong foundation so that then the rest of your body functions well.
Yes, and finding your correct positioning so that when you move, you're not moving kind of in these erratic, like unstable ways. It's about yes, stability is probably the primary thing versus a lot of practices. I mean, I had done yoga, I had done Pilates, and I still do those things. But all of those kind of contributed to this feeling of, I don't know, the focus there is more on flexibility and kind of taking you out of or into a range of motion that might not be.
Muscle toning and strengthening as opposed to the foundational pieces sometimes.
Yeah, and I think they're all connected. I mean, I think if you can look at any movement practice and they have the same fundamental principles, but for me, foundation training spoke to my body and it gave me the tools I needed to really help myself. And that's why I've devoted my life now, kind of this third chapter of my life, to helping people find more balance, better movement, yes, and more, I think, peace. Because one of the big parts of foundation training is the breath work. And so we kind of go back and forth between our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. And that happens on a daily basis. It happens over time. And I would say for most of my life, I've been in my sympathetic nervous system, that fight or
especially
flight.
with the stress in the world today, the more we can try to disengage from the stress piece and move into the parasympathetic and be in a place of rest or a place of caretaking, that helps with the vitality piece in terms of instead of being always being able to be like, oh, okay.
But for me, and I tell an anecdote in the book about how I would do yoga classes, but it would come time for Shavasana, I was out the door. I would never lay still for Shavasana. When my kids were growing up, I'm like, nope, I got to get to the next thing. I got to get them out of daycare. I got to go to the grocery store. I have to do. So I would never lie still. I mean, that was just not in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So now.
Well, you also didn't give yourself permission and you hadn't been taught that part of taking care of yourself is important.
Yes, and I think it was a huge piece for me of like what was missing. And so now that is aside. Again, foundation training was a huge piece of finding that, but I had to go through a lot of grieving and letting go, kind of shedding some layers, listening to my children, telling me what they needed, which was for me to be more still and more quiet. Yeah, and more present for sure, helped with that as well. So it wasn't just one thing.
Right.
But foundation training, I just can't say enough how much it's helped me and how much joy I get from sharing that with people now in this part of my life.
Okay. So one of the things that we did talk about in terms of kind of one of the things you wanted to share kind of about the process of writing the book is that so much pressure and drive in our culture to push and succeed, how that can sometimes serve us, but actually how does it hold us back?
Yes.
Share a little bit about that, how that showed up for you.
Well, it showed up because, again, I was so anxious to get the book out. I mean, for me, it became one more
check mark
to tick off, you know, and so being patient with that, like having to take 6.5 years of my life was a huge challenge for me. But I learned to slow down and let the process happen. I still think I could have probably taken another year to
fine-tune stuff.
But it got to a point where, and my publisher also kind of pushed me, you can keep working on something and you're still never going to find perfection.
Well, that's the whole thing. It's never going to be.
It's
sometimes done is better than perfect.
It's never going to be perfect. And when I look back on the book now, I realize what's interesting is that it captures a piece of my life and a time in my life that is very significant, but it only tells part of the story, because where it stops is, it's just unfinished, because it's not my whole life, right? So
Well, do you have book number 2 in your?
what I've been doing is blogging a lot
Yeah.
since the book, and writing about where I am now. And yes, I think that I do have another book in me, but I haven't. This is the new me. I'm not forcing that to happen. Like, oh, Vicki, you wrote one, now you have to write another. But I definitely am still processing. The book only came out a year ago.
Yeah.
So to me, I'm still kind of taking in and learning.
Well, and sharing the book with people and
Yes.
talking to people about it.
Yeah.
Who do you think is kind of the perfect audience for the book? I mean, it could be anyone, but
it could be
if you were
anyone.
going to give it out as like a Christmas gift or as a, to a friend for their birthday, who would be the best person, do you think, to read it? Someone that's an elite athlete, someone that pushes themselves a lot?
So I think there's a few different groups that I was trying to address or attract and help with this book. Or I mean, help sounds so condescending. It more give my experience so that maybe they can learn from it. So initially, like I said, I wrote it because I do think I know how to recover from injuries. That is something I definitely know how to do. And so in some ways, it's a how-to book of that, because in the back of the book, I have an appendix about all the modalities I use in a physical and emotional way to
Recover.
heal. And there's many things in there, from using hydrotherapy, which was a huge part of my healing, to meditation, to foundation training. I mean, there's so many pieces in there that I think people can learn how to heal from those physical injuries. I definitely think the compulsive athlete is someone who should read this book, because that was me, and it can still be me at times. But people who compulsively move, and especially have one sport that is their go-to sport, and they don't have other outlets.
The cross training makes a big difference in terms of not having as many injuries, for
Yes,
sure.
and I was always a cross trainer, but I
Yeah.
still got injured because I was still so driven. And even when I got injured, I wasn't able to let go of my ego enough to say, okay, I can slow down, process this, and let my body and my mind really heal. So I think that's a lesson that athletes can learn from, that there is a time to stop, just to stop.
Or slow down.
Yeah, slow down. Maybe not, like, I think we want to move as much as we can.
Even when you're injured, even if it's a pretty significant injury, if you stop, everything freezes up. So you need to keep moving, but you don't necessarily have to push yourself in the same ways.
2 days after my car accident, I'm in intensive care, and I'm trying to walk around the nurse's station just to get my mind, because I don't think lying in bed is the answer for anybody.
Most of the time it is not in recovery.
Right. So, yes, but then balancing that out with being kind to yourself, and just, I think that's one of my biggest messages to compulsive and very intense athletes is, don't be so hard on yourself. Recognize that injuries will happen, and that you want to be kind and let your body take the necessary steps it has to get to the next phase. You can't force it. I also think the book is really good for parents, because
So that was one of the other questions that we want to talk about.
Yeah,
kind of
I mean,
the parenting things that no one tells you.
yeah, and when I started out writing the book, I really had no intention of writing about parenting. That was not at all part of the plan. I wasn't going to even write about being in a marriage that, and revealing so much that I
was
do.
challenged.
I mean, I really kind of get very vulnerable and talk a lot about some of the issues that Brian and I had to get through to stay together, and it wasn't easy at times. So I don't want to say it's like a counseling book for marriage, but people could learn from our lessons. It's not a handbook, in other words, but Brian and I really had to
Well, you both
commit.
leaned in.
We leaned in, and there were times where I was so ready to walk out the door or have him walk out the door. But I had made a vow to myself that when I got married, I was going to stay in it.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I'm
some
not-
of the best relationships are the ones where you work through hurdles and challenges together because you're committed to working the process
yeah.
and showing up for each other, which is huge to have someone that has your back all the time.
Yeah, and he and I had such different approaches because he was coming from being an addict. You know, so he started drinking when he was pretty young. And he had all those memories of what he went through as a teenager. And I had experimented when I was a teenager, but I wasn't addicted to substances. So it was very easy for me to try substances and then say, that's not
You
for me.
don't have that addictive personality.
Yes. I mean, I have an addictive personality in terms
To
of
running.
movement, like for sure.
Right.
But not to the substances. So I didn't understand that the way he did. So when we came together to try and help Jade, we definitely came from different
perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which maybe helped. It made for
Her.
some challenging times.
Yeah.
But I do think the lesson there for parents is you don't know what you're going to end up with. And to think when you have that baby, you look at them and you think, oh, I can handle this. I know what's going to happen. I know how to control this. No way. Like, just a complete, for me, utter shock in terms of how much my kids have taught me about what I don't know, what I don't understand, how individual they are, how unique they are.
Well, I actually shared this on a live the other day, but I listened to this podcast, or maybe it was in a book, I can't remember, but how they talk about when they interviewed children when they were 5, like 98% of them were geniuses. And then they interviewed the same kids at 10, and only 32% of them were.
Oh,
and then they interviewed them at 15, and only 3% of them were. And it's because as parents and as teachers and in our system, we remove some of their creativity, we remove some of their independent thinking. And so it sounds like you give some ideas in the book about ways that you can actually let your children sort of drive and dictate some of the things, and that we as parents, even though we think we know it all, that we can really learn a ton from children. And I think we've gotten away from that. We've been like, oh, well, this is the way you do it.
Right. And I think for me, coming from such an academic background, and my family, East Coast Jews, you know,
It's all about school.
It was all about school. And so I actually thought that my kids would follow on that track. But I
be
realized,
academic.
Yeah, but I realized at a young age that they did not
That wasn't
quite
who they were.
fit into that mold. But I took it on as a personal project that I was going to help them navigate school in whatever way I could. So by the time we got through middle school with both of them, it was very clear to me that they weren't traditional learners. I needed to kind of figure out ways to help them, especially Jade. She went to 4 different high schools. And for me, it was never like, well, no, you have to make this work and you have to stay here.
Right.
I helped her kind of find her path. And I don't know that I did the best job. I just gave her permission.
But that's a huge job, is allowing.
I tried. I believe I tried. But at the same time, I was missing certain signals, I think, that she was sending. Fortunately, she felt secure enough to ask for help when she really needed it.
Yeah.
And then we listened, and then she set a path that she was going to graduate high school on time, and she was going to continue to play sports and do everything while in recovery.
Good for her.
And I thought that was absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And she drove that train. I was just there, and my husband was there to support her. But I think now what I've learned, and this is kind of after the book is over, like I don't get to this point in the book.
Right.
I mean, this might be book 2.
Yeah.
Both my kids are now in their 20s, and the lives they're leading are so remarkable. And if you had looked at them when they were in school, they certainly weren't the top students. They were very good athletes, but were they the best on their teams? No. They definitely were gifted in so many levels, but they chose to, I think, take a different path of not striving to be the best, because I think they
watched the example.
reacting to what I was doing. And so they did not want to follow in that path. They needed to find their own way. But now, with what they're doing in their lives, they are achieving amazing things. And
Well, that's a gift as a parent to be able to watch that evolution.
it's so
The coolest
amazing.
thing ever.
It's the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
And it's completely of their own making.
Except for that you gave them a space to be able to do it. So give yourself some credit too. You modeled things that I was talking about this with a business colleague today. Sometimes there's things that you watch that a leader does. So like as a parent in a family as a leader, But in work environments, there's sometimes things leaders do that are like, ooh, I want to do that. Like, I like the way that felt and I like how that went. And then sometimes people do something, you're, ooh, that feels all kinds of icky. I don't want that for myself. So part of watching how leaders perform is to see those are things I'd like to emulate or things I'd like to do.
Right.
And then there's other things that you're like, oh, I think I'd like to do that differently.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
your children learned on their own, but you gave them the space to be okay with pushing back and saying, yeah, that doesn't really work for me.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a huge lesson for parents because Brian and I were endurance athletes from day one. And like that was what we chose. And we thought our kids would choose that too because, hey, you know, we love to run. Why don't you love to run?
Right.
And we introduced them to those sports when they were kids. What we found is they loved team sports. They were both really good, you know, soccer, basketball, all the team sports. Jade played golf in high school. She was very good at it immediately. Did she want to pursue it in college? No, because
Well, they're both social kids.
very social. But I think what we had to do when they were young, and this was harder for my husband than for me for some reason, let go of the idea of them pursuing the sports that we thought they should pursue. So he wanted them to be competitive cross-country skiers because he loved that.
Right.
We taught them to ski from a very, I mean, before they could even walk, they were on cross-country skis. But that was not what they wanted to do. Letting go of that was super hard for him. But I remember saying to him, we cannot push them to do this if they don't want to do it. And what is amazing to me now is seeing how driven they are in their chosen sports. So Jade,
By their own choice.
by their own choice, Jade does roller derby.
Oh,
of
yeah,
all
you
things,
told me about that, yeah.
which to me is, that sport blows my mind. I can't believe she
She's
does.
in Denver, right?
Well, it's Boulder, Denver.
Okay,
I mean,
what's the name of the team?
Boulder County Derby. I mean,
Okay.
yes, and she is phenomenal.
Fun.
Right? And she loves it, and she's so passionate about it.
Well, and you would have never picked for her at 10 to be on a roller derby
No,
team.
I mean, even though we took them, I mean, she could always roller skate, and
yeah,
she
but
liked
it's different than being on roller
so
derby.
different. And then Jessie, the younger one, who never liked water sports when she was younger. I mean, we would go to the beach, and she would get sand on her, and she'd be like, Mom, I have to change. She is now addicted to water sports, and she's big into surfing and hydrofoiling,
Have fun.
which they both love, but Jessie is really
Like
passionate
really
about
committed to it, yeah.
And it's really interesting to me because one of the things I write about in the book is passion and how important that is to find.
Yeah.
And you can only find that from inside. But it's interesting because the Latin derivation, is that the right?
Derivation.
Derivation of passion is patiar, which means to suffer.
Huh.
It's actually derived from the word to suffer.
Because you're so involved
Because
or
when you
immersed
are
in
passionate about something,
it, you avoid everything else at all costs.
and also you have to really give of yourself to that, whatever that is.
Or you make sacrifices for it.
And it involves some level of suffering. To me, what I am striving for and what I hope my kids find is the balance between, yes, you need to have discipline and you need to push yourself if you are passionate about something, but there is a fine line. When you push yourself so hard that everything else in your life suffers, then it's too far.
Right.
So,
So finding the balance.
finding the balance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my kids seem to be finding it way earlier than I found it.
Well, and I think we've, as a culture and society, given more space for people to look at that, whereas historically it was so much more about performance and achievement, and now we look at things a little bit differently, that it is more important to try to find balance or to try to find outlets for self-care,
Yeah.
which was not something that when you were a kid, and certainly, you know, in older generations, that people talked about finding those areas of balance
100%. My mother
or self-care.
called me selfish because of how much self-care I did. Like that was what she saw. I was being selfish.
Yeah.
And I had to really, it was one of the big challenges she and I had because to me running was taking care of myself. Getting massage in my 20s, which was at that time, you got like massage, people didn't even.
Well, you were, as an endurance athlete, your body goes through a lot more, so you need to do it to be able to perform at a certain level.
Right, but it was not seen as something, it wasn't accepted. And
Well, it wasn't normal.
Yeah.
Where it's been much more normalized.
Yeah.
I mean, when my kids were little, I trained for a triathlon when I was turning 40, and I would go to a running class. Because for me, everyone's like, oh, the triathlon and the swim. And I'm like, the swim, it's easy. I like the run, and it's at the end. So I was never a runner. And when I moved to Colorado, I realized I had exercise-induced asthma. And now that I've been at altitude for a long time, it doesn't bother me in the same way. But I got to a place where I was running a fair amount. And I would go to this running group where I started doing like walk run. It'd be 1 minute, 1 minute walk, 1 minute run. I was never an endurance runner. I did run a half marathon though.
That's good.
But when I would go to my running class, the kids were like, oh, you're leaving. Why are you going? It's not fair. And I'm like, oh, but mom will be so much better when I get home. And I think women in general have had to sacrifice a lot of things. And so to be able to do something where you're taking care of yourself physically and emotionally to then be more present when you are home, it is super important. And I think that self-care piece really in in past generations wasn't acknowledged as much. And I feel like current generations and future generations have more awareness to all of that, which I think is super important.
And I definitely think I modeled that for my kids, and they definitely, in their teens, you know, they're still figuring things out, right? And their frontal lobe is not developed, and they're confused, and I don't think they understood, but now I think they actually get it, and they can look back and actually verbalize that to me and say
That they were able to watch some of your
watch
behaviors
that
or patterns,
and now see how much they appreciate that I did that, because to them that they want to model that. That is part of their lives now.
Nice.
They know they need to exercise and get massage and take care of themselves.
Yeah. And then as they move into their next chapter of, you know, maybe having families of their own, they saw that self-care modeled, and it will be hopefully something that helps them be in a better place as they transition.
Yeah, and I encourage them now to take care of their posture. And, you know,
Have you taught them the foundations training?
Oh, yes. And, you know, it's
There's some resistance, I'm sure.
There was some resistance. Now they both realize how important it is.
Nice.
That doesn't mean
That
it's
they do it all the
easy
time.
for them.
Yeah.
Jade is really pretty committed to it. Jessie, it's interesting, just the other day, she was sitting in the living room, and she stood, like, she realized that she was slouching, and she made herself sit up, and because she knows she needs to do it, but at the same time, it's hard for anybody.
Well, it's the whole thing of simple versus easy. It can be easy to do, but then it's also easy not to do.
Exactly.
And so a lot of it's getting into routines.
Right, and I counseled her. I said, I was just in this amazing workshop this last weekend, which I told you about before we started the podcast, is this body reading 101 with this brilliant man named Tom Myers, who wrote the book Anatomy Trains, and it's all about the fascial lines in the body. And what we now know, and I think people have known this for years, but you know, the body will adapt to the patterns that we teach it. So if we move in a certain way, over time, the body molds to those positions. So if we're constantly slouched, your body gets used to being in that position. Well, if you do that for 50 years,
Your body compensates, yeah.
And I said to Jessie in particular, I said, you want to change this now.
Right.
Because your father has that slouch that he really suffers from some back issues because of that. He's very athletic, he's very strong, he's been able to overcome it to a degree. But if you start challenging that and changing those patterns early, you're going to be much better off when you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you know, all the way up.
Well, so a perfect example is, so I introduced you actually to my dad.
Yes.
And he did foundations training. He started doing a lot of it. He had some back stuff that was going on, and he was a golfer for many years and would, you know, walk 18 holes. And then in the last 18 months really sort of went downhill because of his back. And it wasn't an injury. It was just he had some, you know, over time breaking down of the body. And as a physician, I was, you know, you're never a huge fan of telling an 83-year-old man to have back surgery.
Right.
But I haven't gotten to share with you. So he did the foundations, which I think was really helpful, but he went from really being very engaged in his life to being disengaged because there was a decline in his physical state.
Yes.
And to your point of his compensation was then he was like hunched over or slouching, and like his other leg got stronger, but that one, the leg that was affected with the weakness, got weaker and weaker. It got to be where he was walking in the neighborhood every day and walking for golf to where it was a chore just to walk to the mailbox. So he had surgery 3 weeks ago, actually today, and out of the hospital. So he had the surgery in the morning. It was an outpatient procedure. It was a foraminectomy and decompression surgery. And he was not dragging his foot when he got home or a whole lot less. And he's now going on 30-minute walks with my mom every day. His pain was never higher than a 2. Like, it was a huge success story. But the compensatory piece,
Yes.
when you do it over a long period of time, your body decompensates and then
Right.
and compensates, and then you end up in a posture that doesn't serve you. And so the foundation method is super important for people to understand.
Well, I'm so glad to hear he's doing well.
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
And
He's like a different person.
I think what we have to realize is that gravity is pushing down on all of us from the moment we come out of the womb.
Yep.
Right? So we're supported by that amniotic fluid when we're in the womb.
Yep.
As soon as we come out, that starts the moment, you know, I mean, even with babies, you know, when they're just crawling and when they're, you know, in the smallest stage, not so much. But as soon as they start standing,
Well, I'm getting knocked down.
right. And that effect starts taking its toll on the body.
Right.
So I think we need to start teaching people from a much younger age how
Body
to hold
self-care.
Yes, how to hold themselves up, how to fight those imbalances. You know, we want people to be active and find sports that they love to do. But once you find a particular sport, like for example, your dad with golf, that has certain rotational forces that if you're playing golf every day, it's going to have an effect
Right.
on your structure. How do you counterbalance that? With something like foundation training.
Yep.
Maybe Pilates, whatever speaks to you, but
Right.
you have to counter it.
Well, and massage and
All
hydrotherapy
those things.
or
Yes.
heat therapy or cold therapy,
Yeah.
making sure that you're taking antioxidants, like
Yeah.
all the things that we talk in terms of vitality.
Yeah, and runners are the worst because once they find running, it's all they want to do.
Right.
And if they don't find activities to balance out
Well,
what
and-
running does to the body,
And nourishing themselves, because
Yes.
sometimes they want to be thinner because then they can run faster,
Yep.
but they don't then nourish enough, so
Yes.
that it's that, again, fine-tuning and balance.
100%. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I have a whole lot of other questions, but maybe just something fun. What's your favorite fall food or activity?
Oh, well, fall, pumpkin seeds, pumpkin bread, anything
Pumpkin
pumpkin,
everything.
I love. But the other part of my life is that my husband and I now spend the winters in Hawaii.
So, we're going to say pickleball?
So pickleball, right? And my favorite, I am a warm weather girl. I love
The heat.
heat.
Yeah.
I thrive in warm weather, and so yeah. So fall, I like fall. I'm not anxious or too
For winter
excited
in
about the snow
Colorado.
coming this weekend, but I will tolerate it. And as much as I did winter sports, you know, my entire life,
Yeah.
I'm glad to be not in winter anymore. So pickleball is kind of my fun thing that
Great.
I love it because it's social. My husband and I can do it together. But I also love the water. We swim in the ocean. I love to swim.
Awesome.
So yeah, but anything that's fun now.
Yeah.
I mean, I seek out fun activities. And for me, running is still fun. And as long as it is, I'll keep doing it.
Great.
But yeah.
Awesome. So we'll post in the notes below the information about her book. Again, it is Running and Returning, Seeking Balance in an Imperfect World. And then we'll put the link about kind of your bio
Right.
and then information about foundations and maybe even, what was the anatomy?
Anatomy trains.
So we can actually put a link to that as well so
Yeah.
that if any of you are interested in learning more about any of those, you have a
Perfect.
link to it. But thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
As usual, it's so fun to have a conversation.
It feels like just,
and
we've known each other forever. That's
Yeah.
what I feel like.
and a great resource if anyone's looking for a Christmas present for an endurance athlete or just want to share the importance of self-care as we age. So thanks today for tuning in to the Final Percent podcast. And doing cool things with cool people is a big part of our community. So join us on Spotify or any of our other avenues that you can listen to our podcast. And we look forward to seeing you in future episodes. Have a great day.
It's the fire.